A primary goal of many lifters is to reduce body fat. However, pushing leanness to the extreme may cause some unwanted negative effects on health, performance, and muscle development. So what happens when we get too lean? And how far can we push leanness before it becomes an issue? First, let's cover how do we even reduce body fat in the first place? Well, fat loss is achieved by addressing two key factors. The first is weight loss. In most cases, we will need to reduce our total body weight to achieve any significant fat loss. It is possible to experience some fat loss while maintaining body weight if muscle is being built, but this usually won't be significant in most intermediate to advanced lifters. So for appreciable fat loss to occur, we must reduce body weight in most cases. To do this, we need to eat in a calorie deficit over time. In other words, consume fewer calories than we expend on average for an extended duration. This is primarily achieved via a reduction in total calorie intake through dietary choices. However, we can also manipulate the other side of the equation, which is to increase energy expenditure. This can be achieved by increasing our total daily activity levels, usually quantified as total steps per day. Although increasing activity level doesn't seem to have as much of an influence on energy expenditure as we would expect. So diet is usually going to be the primary way in which we induce a negative energy balance. And the other factor required for successful fat loss to occur is muscle growth or retention. We want to try and at least maintain most of our muscle tissue during weight loss so that the majority of lost weight comes from body fat, not muscle. Furthermore, it is possible in some cases to build muscle during a calorie deficit. However, for most intermediate to advanced lifters, we are only expecting a retention of muscle mass in most cases. There are a few ways to maximize the amount of muscle we retain during a calorie deficit. First is by performing resistance training. Resistance training provides the stimulus for muscular adaptations. So without a stimulus, there is no reason for the body to hold onto muscle tissue, whether we are in a deficit, surplus, or at maintenance. Essentially, you would want to train in the same way as if you were intending to build muscle mass. Second is consuming a high protein intake. In combination with the resistance training, a high protein diet is usually going to maximize the amount of muscle we can retain, allowing more of the lost weight to come from fat mass. As a general recommendation, trainees want to consume at least around 1.5 grams per kilogram or 0.7 grams per pound of body weight per day. To further individualize your protein intake, there will be a video linked in the description going into more detail. And lastly is the magnitude of the deficit. A larger deficit will usually increase our likelihood of muscle loss, while a smaller deficit will usually help with muscle preservation. Furthermore, a smaller calorie deficit is usually going to be helpful for diet adherence, as it allows more flexibility with food selection in your daily life. So as a general rule, trainees probably want to lose weight at no more than around 1% of body weight per week to maximize muscle preservation. So now that we understand how to reduce body fat, the question now becomes, how far can we take this? Can we just reduce body fat as low as we want? And what happens when we take this to the extreme? Before we get into the specifics, the overarching principle here is that the leaner we get, the more resistance we encounter from our human physiology. Excessive leanness is likely seen as a threat to survival from an evolutionary perspective. Body fat is essentially just stored energy, so reducing our body fat is basically depleting our energy stores, which might be required at times when food is scarce. Thankfully, food is more accessible in modern times, so starvation is less of a concern, but our physiology doesn't know this. So our body tries to conserve energy in many different ways, which can come at the sacrifice of health, performance, and well-being. Let's now cover in more detail what happens when we reduce body fat to extreme levels. First, let's explore what happens to body composition when getting to extreme levels of leanness. Obviously, we see a reduction in body fat since this is the primary goal. However, the other tissue we are concerned with is muscle mass. In general, we tend to see slight reductions in muscle mass when getting down to very low body fat levels. For example, this case study followed a male natural bodybuilder through a contest preparation and recovery period. Over a 12-month time frame, this athlete underwent an 8-month contest preparation diet, competed in 4 bodybuilding competitions, followed by a 4-month recovery phase. The athlete dieted down from around 100 kilos to around 89 kilos at the time of their competitions. Body fat went down from around 10% to around 6% as measured by bioelectrical impedance. Fat-free mass was initially around 90 kilos, and this was maintained for around 4 months into the diet. It then reduced to around 84 kilograms at their lowest body weight. Furthermore, this lean mass returned almost to baseline after the post-contest recovery period once weight was regained. The researchers also took muscle thickness measurements of the biceps, triceps, and quadriceps, and this showed a similar trend with the sum of all muscle thickness sites being lowest at the athlete's leanest state, before coming back up to baseline after the contest recovery. However, it seems that males tend to be at a higher risk of muscle loss compared with females. This was seen in this research review, which assessed the effects of a calorie deficit on body composition while performing resistance training. Overall, it was found that males generally see a reduction in lean mass during a prolonged calorie deficit, although females are usually able to retain or even continue building muscle mass during a calorie deficit. And this also seems to hold true when females diet to extreme levels of body fat. This was explored in this case study of a female physique athlete. Over an 8-month time frame, this athlete underwent a contest preparation diet, competed in 2 figure competitions, followed by a recovery period. Body mass dropped from 65 to 59 kilograms at the lowest point, with body fat reducing from around 20% to around 11%. And unlike the male competitor, this athlete didn't see any significant losses in fat-free mass, and even continued to see a gradual increase over the course of the 8 months. Although once weight was regained, fat-free mass began to increase at a faster rate. So overall, dieting to very low body fat levels is probably not ideal for muscle mass development compared with being at a higher body fat. And for males, they are probably likely to lose some amount of muscle mass to get to such a point. Whereas females seem to be at a lower likelihood of muscle loss, even when achieving similar relative leanness. And in all cases, muscle mass appears to return back to baseline levels once you eat back up to a higher body fat level, assuming resistance training is being performed. Next, let's look at health. When getting very lean, we tend to see changes in some markers of health. This was seen in this case study of a male natural bodybuilder. Over a 12-month time frame, this athlete underwent a 6-month contest preparation, competed in a bodybuilding competition, followed by a 6-month recovery period. This athlete dieted down from around 103 kilograms to around 89 kilograms. Body fat was reduced from around 15 to 5%, and around 4 kilograms of lean mass was lost. In terms of cardiovascular variables, blood pressure was reduced from 132/69 to 104/56, and resting heart rate dropped from 53 beats per minute to 27. Furthermore, the athlete experienced significant hormonal changes too. Cortisol and ghrelin were increased throughout the diet, while testosterone, insulin, leptin, and thyroid hormones all decreased significantly. And most of these hormones either fell outside the healthy reference range or on the verge of the range at the athlete's leanest state. The lipid blood panel saw some changes, but mostly stayed within the healthy reference range. And for the metabolic blood panel and blood count, there were many changes which put the athlete outside the reference range too, specifically at the time of their leanest state. And specific to females, excessively low body fat levels are associated with what is known as the female athlete triad. This is the idea that consuming a very low energy intake, which is required to get very lean, causes a triad of negative health consequences. First is that this low energy intake often results in disordered eating behaviors, often impacting mental health to some extent. This usually also causes menstrual disturbances or amenorrhea due to hormonal disruptions. And third is a reduction in bone mineral density, putting individuals at a higher risk of osteopenia or osteoporosis. So overall, it seems that getting to very low body fat levels will usually result in some negative health consequences in both males and females. Next, let's look at how energy intake and expenditure changes as we diet to very low body fat levels. As we have mentioned, a calorie deficit is required to achieve significant decreases in body fat. So to get to very low body fat levels, we basically need to maintain a negative energy balance for an extended period of time. Although as we lose more body weight, energy expenditure decreases. So to maintain this deficit, we need to reduce calorie intake even further. This decrease in energy expenditure seems to be a result of both the calorie deficit required to get lean and the reduction in body weight itself. For example, this study explored the effects of weight loss on energy expenditure. 17 obese adults were fed an 800 calorie per day diet for 7 to 13 weeks until they lost 10% of their total body weight. Subjects were then fed a diet to maintain this 10% weight loss for 6 to 8 weeks. They then underwent another 800 calorie per day diet until they lost a further 10% of body weight before maintaining for another 6 to 8 weeks. It was found that energy expenditure reduced after each subsequent weight loss phase. Initially, energy expenditure was around 3,200 calories per day. It then dropped to around 2,600 calories after 10% weight loss, and then to around 2,200 after 20% weight loss. And in terms of which components of energy expenditure dropped, all components saw somewhat of a reduction. Resting energy expenditure dropped as predicted due to a reduction in body weight. And the other main contributor to this decline was movement and exercise. Subjects expended far less energy from movement and exercise, possibly due to increased fatigue and lethargy from the diet, as well as carrying less total body weight around on a daily basis. And the thermic effect of feeding did slightly decrease, but it didn't have all that much of a contribution to total daily energy expenditure anyway. In any case, it is pretty clear that weight loss usually results in a lower energy expenditure in most cases. We can try to boost energy expenditure to some extent by performing more physical activity, but this probably won't fully compensate, and this obviously takes more time and effort to perform. So this makes it more difficult to sustain weight loss since we are required to eat fewer calories and do more exercise to maintain a lower body weight. So when we get to extreme levels of leanness, our energy expenditure is probably going to be quite low relative to where it would habitually be. This means it can be very difficult to adhere to the low calorie intake required to maintain such a body weight. And because of the dietary and exercise habits required to get to and maintain a very low body fat, it is usually practically very difficult to stick with this routine for most people. To achieve this, most people are required to perform excessive physical activity levels and eat an excessively low calorie intake. This will usually require a more rigid lifestyle, potentially involving meticulous food planning and tracking, limiting social events, and spending excessive time exercising to expend energy. So in most cases, this simply isn't feasible from a practical perspective for most people. It is possible, but it will most likely diminish your quality of life to some extent if conducted for extended periods of time. So the question we want to know is, how lean is too lean? How lean can we get before we run into some of these negative consequences? Well, there are a few different ways we can look at this question. First is how lean we can be simply to stay alive. In this case, we can basically be as lean as we want before starvation. This doesn't mean that health or performance will be good, but it is possible to survive. This was seen in the classic Minnesota starvation experiment conducted in the 1940s. This experiment involved 36 men being restricted to a 50% calorie deficit diet, which was around 1,600 calories on average. This was conducted for 24 weeks, resulting in an average 25% weight loss. While the participants survived, they experienced significant negative health effects. It was reported that subjects experienced significant psychological effects such as hallucinations, increased depression, and hysteria. They also experienced negative physiological effects such as an increased prevalence of headaches, reduced sleep, hair loss, edema, and cold intolerance. Basal metabolic rate had been estimated to decrease by around 40% on average, and subjects lost around 40% of their total muscle mass on average. Furthermore, it was reported that subjects displayed disordered eating behaviors such as guarding their food, chewing more gum, eating their meals slowly to make it last for multiple hours, and making food a focal point of daily activities. And one subject cut off 3 of their fingers with an axe, but couldn't remember if it was intentional or not. So while it is possible to survive at extreme levels of leanness, it probably isn't ideal for health and function. That brings us to a more relevant question. How lean is too lean for health purposes? In other words, at what body fat does health begin to diminish? Well, this is a difficult question to answer because there are so many other confounding variables. Most relevant to healthy lifters, the best evidence we can draw upon is another bodybuilding contest preparation case study. Let's look at this case study, which evaluated a natural male bodybuilder throughout a contest preparation period. This athlete underwent an 8-month contest preparation, followed by a 5-month recovery phase. The athlete started at around 14% body fat and dieted down to around 5% before returning to the same initial body fat level post-recovery. And based on these hormone markers, we can see that it wasn't until around the 5 to 6 month mark that hormones started to go outside the healthy reference ranges shown in the dotted lines. and they returned back to healthy levels around 2 to 3 months post-competition. So if we extrapolate this body fat data, we would assume that these points would have correlated with around 9 to 10% body fat for this individual. So although this isn't conclusive evidence, it seems that for males, going below around 10% body fat will likely result in some unfavourable health changes for most people. This would be equivalent to around 17% body fat for females. And it should also be noted that this is subject to some individual variability. Some can go below these levels of body fat and be completely healthy, while others might see some negative markers of health at a slightly higher threshold. And lastly, let's cover how leanness influences muscle growth. So far, we have established that it is possible to survive at extremely low levels of body fat, and you will probably be quite healthy at a relatively low body fat. However, what body fat is it best to be at for maximal muscle growth? Well, I am unaware of any studies directly comparing muscle growth at different body fat levels. However, this Stronger by Science article, written by Eric Trexler, attempted to analyze the effects of body fat percentage on muscle growth. An analysis of 7 studies was performed which included baseline body fat percentage data during the muscle growth interventions. The analysis found an overall slight trend that favoured higher body fat percentages. In other words, those at a higher body fat level tended to experience slightly more muscle growth compared with those at a lower body fat percentage. Furthermore, there is pretty strong anecdotal evidence that being too lean is probably not ideal for muscle growth. If we look at the practices of physique athletes, they almost always gain body weight and body fat after their competition period. Although it is debatable as to how much body fat should be gained, it is almost unanimously seen in practice that physique athletes gain weight after competing. And this probably suggests that to build any significant amount of muscle mass, the super lean state required for physique competitions probably isn't going to be the most productive. So while it is difficult to say what exact body fat is required to maximize muscle growth, I would say that trainees probably want to be at least around 15% body fat for males or around 22% for females to be in the most anabolic state. Going even higher in body fat than this might result in an even greater rate of muscle growth, but it might be counterproductive for fat loss goals. So how do you know if you are too lean for your goals, whether that be health or muscle growth? We don't know our exact body fat levels at all times, and even if we did, the previously discussed cutoff points are just average guidelines. Each individual might respond slightly different at different body fat levels. To know if you are too lean for health purposes, the most direct way to assess this is using health markers. You can take measures such as resting heart rate, blood pressure, and assess various blood markers via a blood test. If there are any abnormalities that could be a result of excessive leanness, then it is probably a sign that you might be too lean for ideal health. But even without physiological health testing, there are some other more intuitive indicators of being too lean. This systematic review analysed the effects of physique contest preparation, where athletes are required to get to extremely low levels of body fat. It was reported that in some cases, athletes experienced reduced sleep quality, with one athlete experiencing bouts of insomnia. Specifically for female athletes, all 4 case studies reported menstrual disruptions. 3 athletes experienced amenorrhea, with the other female experienced delayed menstruation. Furthermore, psychometric outcomes were assessed in some studies. While there were no consistent patterns in specific mood states, some cases are reported that athletes experienced short-term increases in anxiety, and some reported declines in energy and increases in tiredness as the competition neared. And lastly, there were some reports of uncontrolled eating behaviours throughout the contest preparation. So these are some symptoms which are commonly associated with excessive leanness. If you are experiencing any of these symptoms coinciding with significant weight loss, it might be an indicator that your health is suffering to some extent. So taking all this information, let's now establish some practical recommendations. Getting leaner is a primary goal for many lifters. To achieve significant fat loss, we need to lose body weight via a calorie deficit while retaining or possibly building muscle mass. Although getting too lean generally results in some unfavourable outcomes. Taking leanness to the extreme usually results in diminished health and function. The behaviours required to get to these levels can often interfere with your lifestyle from a practical perspective, and it probably isn't very productive for muscle growth. While there are no specific cutoff points as to what is considered too lean, here are a few general guidelines. While you can still survive at extreme levels of leanness, you are probably going to be not all that healthy. Generally, these negative effects start to manifest when dropping below approximately 10% body fat for males or around 17% for females. So for health purposes, you would probably want to be above these approximate ranges. And also going too high in body fat is probably also detrimental to health, but this is a topic for another discussion. And while it might be healthy to maintain a fairly low body fat, it doesn't mean that muscle growth will be ideal. For those wanting to maximize their rate of muscle growth, it is probably a good idea to go up to at least around 15% body fat for males or around 22% for females. Furthermore, these are very general average guidelines. As always, trainees should monitor their own individual response to diet and exercise interventions and adjust their training and nutrition practices to suit their goals. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.